Dear participants, welcome to the 17th Sea Change webinar, the 7th one in the 2013 series, collaboratively being developed between Sea Change Community of Practice and Ms. Lucy Faulkner, Climate Change and Sustainable Development Specialist and former researcher and consultant for ICCCAD and its ARCAB program. And I will introduce Ms. Faulkner to you in a moment. This webinar is one of two webinars that are taking place today under the title Monitoring and Evaluation for Community-Based Adaptation, Unpacking the CARE, PMERL and ARCAB approaches and their interconnection. And the first webinar took place this morning at 10 o'clock Indochina time, and the recording will be made available on our online platform. And right now we have, let me look, 21 participants, and with close to 100 registrations I'm expecting some more people to join us over the next minute. My name is Dennis Boers and I'm the Sea Change team leader, and I will introduce Lucy Faulkner to you in a moment. ARCAB Research for Community Adaptation in Bangladesh, Action Research for Community Adaptation in Bangladesh, and that's ARCAB, is a new long-term action research program focused on generating longitudinal evidence on CBA effectiveness. And ARCAB is a Bangladesh-based consortium that's led by the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and that's ICCCAD. The overarching goal of ARCAB is to develop and share knowledge that results in the transformed resilience of the climate vulnerable poor. And this means the poorest and most marginalized communities are able to adapt to long-term uncertain climate change impacts through sustainable adaptation strategies. ARCAB aims to achieve this goal through a twin-track approach, which will be further explained within this webinar. Ms. Lucy Faulkner presents the ARCAB M&E for CBA approach, a new participatory multi-track monitoring and evaluation strategy designed to contribute to current knowledge gaps on how to plan, deliver and measure the effectiveness of community-based adaptation. The ARCAB M&E for CBA methodology sets M&E adaptation priorities that focus on the needs of the vulnerable poor, while simultaneously responding to the wider range of stakeholders and scales across and for whom information about effective CBA needs to be generated. This morning we had CARE's PMERL methodology, and that forms the first track of this four-tier M&E system, and it focuses on community-driven participatory M&E. The ARCAB approach then builds on this with M&E responsive to additional stakeholder information needs. The recording of this webinar and also all the documents being discussed will be made available on this page. And some of the attendees this afternoon are already Sea Change members, or they might have heard about us. But for those who are new to Sea Change, just a short introduction of what we do. We are a community of practice with currently over 650 members that develops a culture of high-quality, rigorous M&E frameworks, approaches and methodologies for responses and interventions to climate change-related practices in Asia and beyond. And webinars like this one and the one this morning of Tina Rossing are one way in which we share knowledge to improve M&E practices related to climate change interventions. But next to webinars, we also have a weekly newsletter. We maintain a resource library, and we support our members in speaking engagements at conferences and also in publishing their work. And if you would be interested to find out more, just have a look at the platform online, which is www.seachangecup.org. And having given this little bit of advertisement for Sea Change, let me now introduce you to our presenter of today, and that's Ms. Lucy Faulkner. She works in the field of climate change and sustainable development and is experienced in research, project planning and design, monitoring and evaluation, knowledge management and capacity building in both developing and developed country contexts. Lucy has worked with both private and INGO organizations, research institutes and multilateral agencies. She has most recently been working as researcher and consultant for ICCCAD and its ARCAB program. And to date, Lucy has operationalized the ARCAB M&E for CBA methodology in Bangladesh and East Africa. And I'm sure she will talk a little bit more about it in a moment. And my name is Dennis Boers. I'm the Sea Change team leader, and my job is managing the Sea Change community of practice, an online knowledge platform, and the M&E on the M&E of climate change interventions. A little bit of logistics. After this introduction of roughly 5 minutes, Ms. Lucy Faulkner will have 40 to 50 minutes on the ARCAB M&E approach, after which we will have a 20 to 30 minute Q&A session with participants. And if questions would not be answered in those 20 to 30 minutes, we will answer them online and make sure that they are published on our website. And this is the link where also the recording will be placed after this webinar. During the Q&A session, you can type your question or comments in the question field in the software, after which we will collect them and present questions to our presenter. You can already type your question while Lucy is presenting, so you don't need to wait till the end of her presentation. If there are slides or if there are certain parts of her presentation where you have a question about, just at that point type in your question. And I have to say, with this introduction, I now will stop talking and I will hand over the microphone and also the screen to Ms. Lucy Faulkner. Lucy, you're on.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much for that introduction. I would also like to start by thanking Tina Rossing for her previous webinar on the CARE PMERL approach as the first in this two-part webinar series on M&E for Community-Based Adaptation, which I will refer to as CBA throughout this webinar. For those of you who are not yet familiar with the CARE PMERL approach, the front cover of the manual is presented on this slide, and I highly recommend that you explore its contents. Its approach is innovative and it's niche, and as Tina will have explained in detail during her webinar, this is because it drives participatory M&E processes specifically for CBA projects. So the core of this approach is to ensure that M&E for CBA is driven from the bottom up, and that it is inclusive of and based on adaptation metrics defined at local scale by those poorest and most marginalised groups that CBA interventions aim to support. So this is an approach that is very much needed in current M&E practice to support investment that is relevant. Many business as usual M&E approaches largely dominating the current CBA landscape set M&E adaptation priorities that are often inappropriate to local community needs, as institutional perceptions of adaptation benefits are often more than not easier to demonstrate than priorities that respond to the needs of the most vulnerable on the ground. So building on this, I would like to start from where Tina has left off and carry this discussion on unpacking M&E for CBA forward by first setting the scene within which the ARCAB M&E for CBA methodology, which integrates the CARE PMERL approach, has evolved. So if we start by looking at some emerging tensions within the arena of M&E for CBA, it's evident that M&E practice is certainly not straightforward. Many discrepancies exist, partly stemming from ongoing debates within policy, practitioner and research circles over what adaptation M&E frameworks and metrics should look like and how they should be applied. This is in part due to the fact that adaptation is a relatively new concept for us still, that is operating under uncertainty and changing climate contexts, rendering understanding of what needs to be adapted to still very unclear. Moreover, there's little agreement on what actually constitutes successful or effective CBA, and therefore what to measure and how to measure it. Furthermore, there is lack of consensus around the really key question of who should success be defined by. Monitoring and evaluation is to provide critical support to the long-term process of identifying what works for CBA. So therefore the question of who does M&E of adaptation work for needs to be raised. So for example, and as already Tina has highlighted through her webinar, participatory M&E for CBA is driven from the bottom up in order to respond to the information needs of those communities that we work through our CBA interventions on the ground. However, those households and communities that we work with on the ground are not the only stakeholders engaged in the CBA landscape within which our CBA interventions operate. As we know, adaptation does not happen in a vacuum, but in an institutionally rich context. As I will explain in further detail in due course, there are multi-stakeholders and audiences seeking different information needs, therefore, on what successful or effective CBA looks like. And due to this, M&E approaches that take a one-size-fits-all viewpoint are unlikely to work in the context of CBA. So this is why the ARCAB M&E for CBA approach has devised a multi-track methodology designed to respond to the information needs of these varied audiences, while also setting M&E adaptation priorities that focus on the needs of the poorest and most marginalised. So based on this, I would like to advocate that more multi-track M&E strategies are needed if progress towards effective M&E for CBA is to be made. So before I continue to explain or go on to explain the following multi-track ARCAB strategy, let me briefly just state what ARCAB is to aid your understanding of what our M&E system is aiming to achieve. So as Dennis has said, ARCAB is a new long-term action research program aimed at generating longitudinal evidence on CBA effectiveness through learning by doing approaches. ARCAB came about as although CBA interventions are multiplying in quantity and quality in most countries, CBA still remains a relatively new field of study with a lack of rigorous scientific evidence on its effectiveness. So ARCAB is a consortium, as Dennis said, consisting of 11 INGO partners, including CARE, Save the Children, ActionAid, Oxfam, Practical Action, Concern Worldwide, among others, and numerous local, national, international research partners, including IIED, IDS. So by working together, we're aiming to develop and disseminate scientific evidence on effective CBA strategies that build transformed resilience for the climate vulnerable poor. And this is the aim of what our M&E system is trying to work towards. So what does this mean? Climate vulnerable poor refers to those people who live in regions that are vulnerable to climate change and who have low adaptive capacity. Transformed resilience means that the climate vulnerable poor are able to adapt long-term to uncertain potential future climate change impacts through sustainable adaptation strategies. So it's important to highlight here that as a consortium of many different partners, this goal of transformed resilience is a collaborative one based on many INGO M&E needs. So this means that the ARCAB M&E for CBA methodology is contributing to those existing gaps in evaluation knowledge that I highlighted earlier, i.e. what constitutes effective CBA and therefore what is needed to measure its effectiveness and how is this effectiveness to be measured. Similarly, in line with the goal of ARCAB, it's important to point out that its M&E for CBA supports interventions progress towards addressing future uncertain climate change risks, not just current climate variability, which many of our INGO partners were and are doing. Therefore, part of this methodology is to aid understanding of what's the difference between adaptation to climate change and adaptation to climate variability, and what does this mean we need to be doing differently in terms of planning and M&E practice. Another key point I'd just like to make here to avoid any confusion is that although the ARCAB M&E for CBA approach was initially designed for the ARCAB program that is based in Bangladesh, it is gaining rapid recognition and uptake by the international community. So the framework's practicability and accessibility to stakeholders in different adaptation contexts is currently supported through its use in CBA projects across differing ecosystem and livelihood zones, not only in Bangladesh, but also in numerous countries across Africa, as is shown on this slide. So the ARCAB approach is therefore universal in application and use. So you don't have to be an ARCAB partner to make use of this innovative M&E approach, as its aim is to assess change affected by a CBA project in moving towards transformed resilience and therefore effective CBA in line with multi-stakeholder needs. I will share with you towards the end of this webinar how the M&E for CBA system was used with these stakeholders, and also at the end I will also share the feedback from these stakeholders that we have received. So you can show what they think of it and how it's been working in practice. Okay, so now let me move on to the ARCAB methodology itself. So as I've said, the goal of ARCAB is transformed resilience for the climate vulnerable poor. So CVP on this slide here stands for climate vulnerable poor. And this is a goal that we're saying leads to effective CBA. So transformation is a huge buzzword at the moment in the development sector among academics, policymakers, CBA practitioners and the wider community of practice. It implies something big, substantial change, new ways of doing things. But what does it really mean for us in our CBA projects? So in order to devise this strategy for effective CBA, we've undertaken a thorough literature review on transformation as well as resilience. So as is shown on this slide, we believe that to make progress towards transformed resilience and therefore effective CBA, 4 interlinking pathways of change are needed. So the first path that is needed is here: resilience is scaled up. This means resilience has been successfully built across governance scales from local to international level. Second is resilience is scaled out. This means that effective CBA for climate change risk has been successfully expanded to reach more people. Third of all here, we're saying the third pathway is resilience building is transformative beyond business as usual, that's what BAU stands for here, business as usual development and disaster risk reduction. So this means doing things differently, that the implications of climate change have been taken into account in development planning, leading to a shift in development paradigm from short-term project-side approaches to those more long-term, those more integrated and participatory, that put project participants in the driving seat of adaptation design. The fourth pathway here is resilience is sustainable over time. So this means that sustainable resources and institutions are in place in order to facilitate delivering adaptation benefits and needs to the climate vulnerable poor groups we work with on the ground. And this also means that sustainable and flexible systems for learning and knowledge generation to inform longer-term planning takes climate change impacts into account. So before we look at these pathways in closer detail, and for those of you who are not yet familiar with the format of this slide, this is what we've used, and it's a theory of change. So we've taken a theory-based approach to evaluation that starts with developing a theory of change itself. So in brief, a theory of change is an outcomes-based planning tool that defines all the building blocks required to bring about a long-term given goal. So here the long-term goal is transformed resilience to the climate vulnerable poor. So compared to the logical framework or log frame approach, we believe a theory of change is more useful for M&E for CBA, as it allows us to map out each step that is needed to affect change. So it allows us to see what needs to be monitored and evaluated, as well as why and for whom. Also, a theory of change approach allows stakeholders and us to respond to the complexity required by our CBA projects. So it facilitates us to plan, to plan within the messy reality of the diverse conceptual vulnerabilities that support and or hinder the CBA process. So it's a living roadmap that can be adapted in response to changing circumstances, and therefore a theory of change is more likely to respond to the challenges that an uncertain environment and other non-climatic risk factors bring. So therefore, a theory of change really allows us to have a more fluid and flexible M&E system. Okay, so if we look at this resilience is scaled up pathway in closer detail, as I said, scaling up refers to governance. It's about mainstreaming CBA into institutional processes. So it's about ensuring an enabling environment for the delivery of adaptation benefits to the climate vulnerable poor, which is integral in facilitating CBA in the context of climate change and hence working towards transformed resilience. So scaling up includes institutions from local to national and also up to international levels. But as our focus is on communities at local scale, focusing therefore on local institutions is a first key step. So if we just look at this in more detail, if I take the bottom 3 outcomes here, which form the bottom of this pathway, we're saying to support scaling up, ultimately, we need to start with ensuring that local institutions have business as usual functions in place before integrating climate risk management into them in order to avoid maladaptation. So we need to be ensuring that local institutions are first of all operating effectively. We also need to make sure that institutions need to understand and possess skills and knowledge to manage climate change. So this includes new knowledge here, new knowledge, climate change knowledge and adaptation science. I'll come on to what this means in more detail shortly, but it's really looking at the mix of scientific information, so looking at future trends with locally generated community knowledge on past trends and links to vulnerability. So we're talking about a new knowledge here. But we're also looking at this outcome here, which shows the climate vulnerable poor have access to those institutions deemed important for adaptation by them, and that these institutions need to be responsive to their articulated demands. So these show the bottom 3 outcomes, and if these 3 are in place, that technically this outcome will be able to be achieved. This is how the theory of change works. So if we look in closer detail at resilience is scaled out pathway, so this means, as I said, that CBA is reaching a larger number of people beyond immediate project boundaries, both through diffusing knowledge and action across communities, but also up through institutions and organisations as part of scaling up. So actually, for the ARCAB programme, we actually originally divided scaling out into 3 distinct areas, but only this pathway is relevant here today. The other 2 are much more relevant for the ARCAB programme particularly. So what we're looking at here is that scaling out means CBA practice is diffused from target to non-target communities, and this is something we really hope to see happens more within our CBA interventions. So this is something that cannot be learnt or taught. It will happen to the, it will happen by the communities themselves if they see the value in it. So if we're looking at this outcome here, for example, so we're talking about, innovative CBA practice is needed. So we're looking about changing practice, doing something differently in light of supporting new knowledge and capacity. So for adaptation to climate change, changes in practice that lead to transformational climate resilience in the long term is required. If we look at an outcome down here, another key thing that we're looking at is about empowerment. The climate vulnerable poor are empowered to articulate adaptation and development needs. So empowerment is central to building adaptive capacity, empowering people to do things better, providing them with the knowledge and understanding so they have the skills and information needed to demand for services and benefits they need for adaptation for themselves, and also providing with the platform from which they can do this. So, CBA is a sustainable process done by communities. It's not done for them or to them by us, it's done by them. And they need the knowledge and capacity to make better informed adaptive decisions. I can also pick up here, going back to the new climate change and adaptation science information that is needed. So one component of knowledge about climate change and adaptation science, but information only becomes knowledge when people are able to use it in decision making. So this means that it has to be relevant and it has to be meaningful to those adapting. So INGOs need to build the capacity of other institutions to act as boundary organizations between scientific information and information users to translate this information on climate change into knowledge that households, communities and other relevant local institutions can use to inform adaptation practice. So another component of this new knowledge is information generated at the local scale by climate vulnerable people about why climate impacts matter and the local context of vulnerability and adaptation. So this information is what is critical for informing the design of feasible, credible and useful adaptation options and support. It is also about creating platforms for empowering climate vulnerable people to articulate the knowledge that is needed, which often goes overlooked in the design of development and climate change support. So if we look at the third pathway, resilience is transformative beyond business as usual development and DRR. So we're saying that if scaling out and scaling up is in place, then CBA practice is likely to be transformative beyond business as usual development and DRR, as the 4 blue building blocks you see on this screen here show the outcomes of these processes. So what does this mean? So transformative beyond BAU development and DRR means people and institutions are practicing CBA and are adapting in anticipation of uncertain long-term climate impacts. If CBA practice is to be responsive to climate change and not just climate variability, development needs to be done differently. So climate change now provides us with an opportunity to retarget development processes away from business as usual and towards longer-term transformational change. So this requires INGOs and other organizations implementing CBA activities to focus less on what their project does and more on what their project leaves behind. In other words, what is the long-term legacy of the project? How has the project affected change that enables people to adapt to climate change rather than climate variability? So what does the project need to achieve in the short term to enable longer term change? So these kinds of questions signify the starting point for CBA design that aims to target adaptation to climate change specifically. So this means engaging and integrating new climate change knowledge, as I've said, into decision-making processes. It means adopting a longer-term outlook, using more flexible and responsive systems to planning, moving out of organizational and institutional silos towards collaboration and co-learning approaches to working, and also moving towards bottom-up approaches that put the empowerment of marginalised and vulnerable people in the driving seat. And as it also says on this slide, it's also about those spaces for knowledge sharing and learning to be in place to facilitate CBA knowledge, capacity and practice transfer between and over generations with communities. So having mechanisms in plan to discuss and generate knowledge for adaptation is important. But having access to information on climate change is not enough on its own. So we need to be supporting spaces where people empowered with the right kind of knowledge can unite together to decide what works and what does not. So these kinds of aspects are moving beyond business as usual processes. If we look at the fourth pathway here, resilience is sustainable over time, you will see that again scaling up and scaling out are also the same preconditions for this process, hence the same 4 building blocks are required in order to get to this goal. So sustainable over time refers to beyond the lifetime of individual CBA projects. So this means that the climate vulnerable poor continue to reap the benefits of a CBA intervention in terms of access to institutions, resources and knowledge, and they're able to continue to use these benefits in undertaking long-term adaptive actions. So it also means people are taking into consideration changing future climate and other contexts, and so as I said before, are actively planning uncertainty. And also, if we look at this outcome here, it's not just information about climate that people need, but also other risks. Climate isn't the only risks people face. And as we know, climate change is likely to have a multiplier effect on other stresses, intensifying existing issues at community level. So fully understanding the adaptation context is therefore crucial to CBA planning. Okay, so what do we have if we put all this together? Now, I know this slide has not come out very clearly at all, and I'm aware of that, but as I've just gone through the previous slides, it's okay. The point of this slide is to show you something else. So if I just show you briefly here, this is the ultimate aim, transformed resilience, and these are the 4 pathways. So resilience is scaled up, resilience is scaled out, resilience is transformative beyond development and DRR, and that resilience is sustainable over time, and these are all the outcomes that show to get towards the goal. So as we can see, it's complex. There are many components of each pathway that overlap and are interchangeable. But what I really want to briefly touch on here is to show the elements of doing something in a transformational way and how to move towards transformational adaptation to climate change. So the first thing you'll see, as I've just gone through with you, that there are many boxes within this theory of change which moves towards transformed resilience and effective CBA that are to do with new knowledge. And as I've explained, it's bringing new knowledge to a process in itself doesn't necessarily intermediately make it transformational. What we need to do is to think about what kind of knowledge is being brought to the process and how that knowledge is used to turn from knowledge into practice. So we're saying, yes, it's to do with climate information, but not just this. You know, a lot of climate information just tells us that things are becoming more uncertain, which isn't that helpful for us. So we need a lens that provides us with more certain information on possible outcomes. So it's this new knowledge of integrating future scientific information with locally generated information with what's going on at local scale, and bringing these two aspects together. So what it's doing, it's forcing us to rethink the way we do environmental and development planning, and forcing us to realise that we can't just rely on local knowledge on its own of past climate trends, and we can't just rely on potential future climate change information either. We need to be bringing the two strands together, bringing both these stakeholders together so new knowledge that is useful can come about. So the second thing that is transformational that we need to be looking at about CBA is a rights-based approach, which is what most NGOs are adopting anyway. So I won't go on about this too much here, but just to say, as I've said before, adaptation as a process is done by communities themselves, and CBA is just a support mechanism to facilitate this. The third aspect that we need to be looking at that's transformational is institutional capacity and mainstreaming CBA into institutional processes. So this is transformational, as a lot of CBA currently happening takes a very project-sized approach to planning and short-term outlook. It doesn't look at what happens when the project ends or leaves. So, you know, we do our final evaluations, we will have to for donors at the end, and that's almost it. What makes CBA transformational, therefore, is analysing the local institutional context, ensuring an enabling environment is in place at the local level, and we make sure that institutions integrate CBA so that when a project leaves, the project can effectively continue. And the fourth just aspect I'd like to point out here, again, is this creating forums for learning and deliberation. So this links with this new knowledge, as I said, and it's about platforms to debate information. It's not enough for INGOs or other organisations to, you know, just tell communities what they can do and what their options may be. We need to also provide spaces that communities decide for themselves out of what the information they're given, what works and what doesn't work for them. So we're supporting communities to make decisions that are right for them. The last thing to say about this slide is the two colours. You will see some boxes and some outcomes are outlined in green, some are outlined in red. So everything in red is geared more towards transformative processes. So as we can see that when we're looking to achieve transformative resilience, we don't have to be doing specific climate change actions necessarily. What we need to be doing is using a climate change lens to revisit development and DRR processes and to consider whether or not they are sustainable over time and whether or not they're scalable. The boxes in green are slightly more tailored towards climate change, and they focus more on this new knowledge that I've spoken quite in detail about, the way this knowledge is coming in and the ways in which we can use it. So what else we can use this theory of change for effective CBA to show us are the domains of change for measuring CBA effectiveness. So we looked at the theory of change and we decided, what do all these building blocks have in common? What is it that we are trying to affect? What is necessary for each precondition and outcome to reach the ultimate impact? And we noticed that there were a series of outcomes, unsurprisingly, that to do with knowledge transfer and knowledge sharing, as I've explained. So we're looking at measuring change in knowledge at different scales for different people. But knowledge is not enough unless people and institutions have the capacity to act on it. So this means having the skills, the power, the ability, including finance, to turn knowledge into practice. So this applies in the context of both the individual and household, so in terms of having access to basic assets, resources, institutions that enable them to adapt to climate variability and climate change, but it also applies to the context of institutions who need access to resources and incentives to turn knowledge into action and the mandate to do this. So supporting changes in knowledge and capacity will ultimately lead to changes in practice. So this can be adaptive strategies undertaken by local people or shifts towards a more integrated, long-term, flexible, strategic and participatory way of development planning. So what we want to know is the knowledge and capacity building we're doing through our projects, is it making a difference to what people do? Do people value it? Do they care? Is it needed? So we need to be looking and measuring at what is done differently. And of course, all these three aspects are interlinked. When you change practice, you're then obviously building new knowledge. So as you will see shortly in my presentation, these domains of change, knowledge, capacity and practice, are used to form the ARCAB CBA-ME for CBA indicator framework to assess effectiveness in building resilience to climate change impacts. A theory of change is also very useful because it then takes us back to understand who are the multi-stakeholders and scales engaged in CBA that we need to make sure our M&E caters to. So as we can see on the right, we have here our climate vulnerable poor communities that we work with at household and community scale. So these are the ultimate stakeholders for whom we're trying to affect change through our projects. But as we know, adaptation doesn't happen in a vacuum, so we also need to be looking at affecting change and working with institutions at local scale who are identified as important and relevant by the climate vulnerable poor themselves for delivering adaptation benefits and needs that they need. We can't just look at what communities are doing, in other words. We also need to be looking upstream to what is happening within local institutions. So the third stakeholder group we need to be looking at is INGOs, it's ourselves, who we need to be looking at our capacity of what we're doing. How do we move from business as usual DRR to adaptation to climate change? How do we know if we're making a difference? And the fourth stakeholder group is the wider community of practice at national and international scales. So this forces us to look at what is the purpose of our M&E, and each stakeholder group has different information needs. So the information needs we need to be looking at is, for ourselves, how are we translating new knowledge and capacity that we may be learning into effective practice on the ground that leads to transformed resilience? So we need to be looking down at our projects and how can we draw information from them that measures change? So we need to be looking at changes in the communities that we're working with and also those locally identified institutions at project level. But then we also have the information needs of the communities themselves. We all talk about PME and participatory M&E, but what does this mean? It's not just about consulting communities in M&E that we're going to do anyway. They have their own specific information needs. So they have a right to information on the performance of adaptation delivery agents. And this can be NGOs, us themselves, as well as other local partners and local institutional service providers. But they also require external information on livelihoods. They may not want just information on climate change, but they also need non-climate information, such on market forces, which will help them decide what is right for them to be doing. So it's really about that they have this right to information. It's about us providing information that they want to know. How they use it is ultimately up to them. And then we also have information needs of the wider community of practice. They want to know what's the value and effectiveness of CBA compared to other investments. CBA can be expensive, and to date it's not reaching across scales, or it's not documented very well if it is. So donors, researchers and policymakers want information from our programs that show results. And why should we invest in you? So these are the M&E needs that we need to be responding to. So how does this fit into a multi-track strategy? So the first track, as we've touched on at the beginning, and as Tina's webinar really went into in detail, it's about PME at community level. I won't go into this in too much detail, as Tina's done a fantastic job of doing that through hers, and we are looking at using the CARE PMERL approach to do this, as it's one of the main approaches at the moment specifically catered to CBA. But what we're looking at is domains and indicators defined by the community, and that the community learning is fed back into the community adaptation plans. So this is a process that's initially supported with external support, but with a view for community monitoring groups to keep undertaking this practice once the projects end. So the second track on our M&E strategy is we're looking at M&E of CBA at and across project CBA sites. So really looking at the question, are we doing CBA effectively? So we're looking at domains, as I said, we're looking at assessing the progress of our interventions, and the domains are set by ARCAB. This doesn't mean the ARCAB program per se, but just this ARCAB methodology. So we're looking at those domains of knowledge, capacity and practice with indicators designed by INGOs, local partners and communities. So we need to be measuring, so how are we going to measure this progress at and across project sites, and what are we measuring for CBA effectiveness? So let me just help explain that for you. So in order to measure CBA effectiveness, what we're saying is, first of all, we're looking at adaptive capacity indicators at community level. This is what we're calling downstream indicators, and KCP here stands for knowledge, capacity and practice. So this is underpinned by the acceptance that good development is the starting point for adaptation. So therefore we're looking at development proxies measured in light of climate change. So changes in assets, livelihoods and well-being, for example. This also includes DRR, as it's based on the premise that people who are well adapted to environmental hazards will also be able to manage many climate risks. But also adaptive capacity includes access to and use of information on climate and other risks. So we also need to be looking at adaptive capacity around indicators on sources, availability, levels of and use of relevant and locally meaningful climate and non-climate information. So as I've explained, if we're to achieve resilience at scale and over time, we also need to strengthen an enabling institutional environment to support adaptation. So we therefore need to be looking at institutional capacity and mainstreaming indicators, so assessing institutional and service accessibility and inclusiveness, including the knowledge and capacity of these institutions to deliver adaptive benefits. It also includes assessing the knowledge and capacity of these institutions to integrate and manage climate risk management into existing planning and provision. So our theory of change says that if people have the capacity and the enabling environment to adapt, they can and they will. So we're therefore also looking at indicators around evidence of adaptive behaviour. So use of climate risk information, shifting strategies from coping to adaptation, and also looking around diversifying livelihoods. So what makes this slightly different is that all these indicators need to be measured in light of climate and other risks. And this conceptual framework for what we're measuring and how we're measuring CBA effectiveness has been adapted from our colleagues at IIED in their TAMS approach, which is tracking adaptation and measuring development. So just to help you understand what this means in practice, therefore, this is an example indicator framework that we've used to evaluate ActionAid Bangladesh's latest community-based adaptation program. So here you can see we have our outcome areas of upstream, so institutional capacity, and downstream, changes in adaptive capacity at community level. If we look to the sub-indicators column, we have indicators, these to do with knowledge, these are capacity, and these are practice here. So we're looking at, for example, level of knowledge of key institutional players of climate variability and climate change impacts. Looking at the level of their knowledge of the needs of the climate vulnerable poor. So again here, this evidence of business as usual management functions need to be measured, as well as percentage of climate vulnerable poor actively participating in local planning and budgeting meetings. To move on to downstream indicators, to give you an example, we were looking at indicators to do with knowledge of level of access to regular and updated sources of weather and climate information, and evidence of learning and lesson transfer beyond project activities, as well as evidence of changes in value of assets, so these are capacity, evidence of improved livelihood outcomes. So these are all tailored specifically to this specific project. To give you another example, this is the indicators that we use for Save the Children in Ethiopia. And what is important here is that this wasn't a CBA project. So this indicator framework can measure effectiveness for all different types of projects. The Save the Children project was actually a participatory natural resource management program, and they wanted some help. They hadn't thought about climate change necessarily from the outset when the project started quite a few years ago, but by the end of it they wanted to understand how much their project had anyway built adaptive capacity for their project participants. So the ARCAB framework was easy to translate to this context as well. So we're looking at some great capacity indicators here that we've used with our colleagues at ARCAB actually to do with capacity, and that they're looking at, that we've used and put into practice here. So we're looking at evidence of ability to discuss and generate and adapt this existing capacity and practice to changing circumstances if required. Again, for capacity, ability to trade off possible futures and consequences given uncertainty in planning and decision making. If we're looking at downstream indicators, changes in poverty levels in light of climate risk, and evidence of change in attitude and use of competencies to plan and implement innovations. And it's just come off the screen here, but this one actually says at the bottom, level of change in project participation perception and ability to manage future drought risk measured from before the project started. So just really quickly to touch on this, what I haven't spoken about here, these high-level indicators. So these sub-indicators are measuring change at a specific project, but what as M&E practitioners we also need to be doing is moving away from measuring just what's happening at project level, but to be aggregating progress across a number of different sites. For example, many of our projects, for example, if I worked most recently with UNDP, for example, in Namibia, their CBA program was across 10 plus countries, not just Namibia. So we need to be also looking at how we aggregate progress across different projects in different areas. And these high-level indicators are the first attempt to try to do this. So it's just picking one key indicator to measure change over different projects. But this is definitely areas that we all need to be looking at and growing into as M&E practitioners. So if I go back then, the next track on our strategy, so we've done PME at community level, we've done M&E of CBA at and across project sites. We also need to be looking at M&E of NGO capacity, as I said, delivering those information needs of what we're doing. So looking at answering that question, where are we now to support effective CBA as an organisation, and what do we need to do to get towards transformed resilience?
Lucy, I quickly want to give you a 10-minute warning.
No problem. Thank you, Dennis.
Yep.
So to help us do this, we have built this CBA resilience scale, which in practice has had very good feedback for helping conceptualize what are we doing now, where does it sit on the scale, and therefore what do we need to be doing extra to help us move further towards adaptation to climate change. So our ultimate goal is this: moving towards transformative adaptation to climate change, which could be said transformed resilience in this box. But what this shows you is that in order to get to this, we need to be doing development as long as it's transformative development. And we need to be doing DRR and adaptation to climate variability as long as it's transformative processes under this step. And together they form a transformative adaptation to climate change. So these are many elements that have already been picked up on our theory of change. So moving away from project size development towards more longer term focus, moving away from inflexible linear planning and poor participation, moving more towards empowerment of vulnerable households, community driven, bottom up accountability, flexible responsive planning and strong institutional processes. And again, moving away from just use of scientific information towards strong community knowledge of climate variability and moving away, I can carry on. Moving away from more of those scientific information to integrating more local knowledge in that together. So this would come up now on your screen, is just an example to show how this scale works in practice. And this is an example of the work I've done in conjunction with IIED with Save the Children Ethiopia. So as I said, this shows them that most of what is in red is transformative and they've done a great job, and just what is in black is business as usual, or conventional as they prefer to put it in their own terms. So it shows you that a lot of what's been happening, as is expected, this wasn't a CBA or a climate change project, a lot of it comes under transformative development and transformative adaptation to climate variability and DRR. But also, these are processes which can move towards adaptation to climate change based on recommendations that we made to them. But it's also just worth pointing out that this is a long-term view, this scale. Hardly anyone is down this end of the scale as yet. This is the goal we're working towards, and it's a long-term goal. It will take time. So if I then go to the last track on our strategy, as we've said, we also need to be doing M&E of the community of practice. This is actually not developed under ARCAB as yet, it's in progress, so I can't share that much with you now, but all I'm saying is that it's used to assess communication and networks, and we need to be looking at domains and indicators set by ARCAB, not by the ARCAB program, but by this ARCAB methodology, and it's good for INGO and international learning. So this is the ARCAB M&E for CBA multi-track strategy. If we just look at that slide in a slightly different context, what is important here are these two big blue arrows. This shows that the M&E strategy is flexible. We need to be learning from and for change. So what we're learning at PM&E level with communities is fed back in to the wider community of practice to draw these lessons within and also across ARCAB sites to build this body of knowledge that we need to attract adaptation funding that is relevant. And also the lessons that we learn at the wider community of practice level can filter down and through and generally at the, eventually get down to PM&E level. So knowledge management here, KM, and communications is integral to these M&E processes that we have. So this just shows the blue circles here are our standardized baselines from which we draw the common indicators, and then we can aggregate context-specific indicators from the projects to draw these lessons. And also we're looking at therefore having PME baselines as well, which then draw information generated at PME level for reflection, learning and feedback at community level, as Tina's webinar went through in some detail. So this is the ARCAB strategy. I also said at the beginning I wanted to share with you some feedback that we've had on it from people I've worked with in Africa. I know it's dense what I've just been through with you. There's a lot to take on board, but when you start working on it in practice, it does become quite straightforward and simple, I can promise you. Hence this feedback from Save the Children in Somaliland. And what I did in Somaliland was to set up an M&E framework for a new DRR climate change adaptation project. So we developed a theory of change with all their project stakeholders from community to national, to national government level, and then developed a framework of indicators which will then go on to lead to a baseline. So the feedback we've got is this: it's a simple and clear tool, yet very powerful in laying a pathway to achieving more sustainable, forward-looking and flexible programs. And it's very successful in shifting thinking and aligning different stakeholder efforts towards resilience. The ARCAB framework can also then be used just for evaluation, so it can be used in two ways, and it was used just for evaluation with Save the Children Ethiopia, and this is the feedback we got from them. It's provided important insights into complex community-based change processes. It stimulated inspiring reflections for upgrading our intervention strategy, and it's contributed crucial added value to better learning towards better adaptation to climate change. So this is some great feedback that we have received that obviously we're very happy with. As I said, this is a we're still testing and using this to see how it works. So this feedback is really crucial for all our M&E and CDA learning. So that really brings me to the end of my presentation. We have published the ARCAB M&E final paper and report, which I'm more than happy to share with you. So if you would like a copy, please email me at my address that's on the slide here, and I'm sure I can also make this available through SeaChange. I think it's actually already on the SeaChange website as well. And also please email me if you have any questions in addition to those that may be asked next. As I said, it takes some reflection and time going through this to really take on board everything I've said. But thank you very much for your time and for your patience, and I hope you found it useful. Okay, back to you, Dennis.
Thank you, Lucy. I will take back the screen now for the Q&A session.
Sure.
And let me see, yeah, show my screen. And everyone should start seeing my screen right now, yes. I already got in 5 questions, so I think for some people it sunk in really quickly, and that's very nice to see. And I'll start with the first one, which is from Innocent Hitimana, and the question is, what are the strategies that we can use to fully get beneficiaries involved in the M&E planning for the intervention? And with fully, he means how can we get them involved from project design to project outcome evaluation in the end?
Sure. Would you like me to answer that question now?
Yes.
Or get okay. Sure. Well, what I would really strongly recommend is that you listen to Tina's webinar. As I said, that Tina and I have done this in conjunction, and Tina's webinar before mine really focused on the CARE PMERL approach, which is just this. It's an approach that is used to design community engagement in project planning from the planning stage onwards throughout the project cycle, and this process has been designed specifically for CBA. So I know many INGOs have their own ways of working, but this is in particular I think one that stands out due to its specific progress. But there are many ways that we can do that, and like you say, it's very important that we do bring the project stakeholders at local scale for change, who we're trying to affect, directly into the project planning from the beginning all the way to evaluation. So I know that within the PMERL approach, they have an approach that's called future visioning. And we also use an approach similar that we've used for the higher tracks on our ARCAB strategy through the theory of change. So to help project planning, what we have done is help to, and which is the visioning exercise in the CARE PMERL approach, is to start by getting stakeholders to think in a different way, get them to start thinking long term. What is the long term change that you want to be seeing within your household, within you as an individual, within your community? Which takes some time. I don't think communities, the way that NGOs have been working with them is all very short term, so it takes some time to help them understand that they can, what are the long-term goals they can achieve. And then you work backwards through a similar theory of change approach to what are the steps that are then needed in order to reach that goal. And that then brings you to your project activities, what you can be doing. So as it's all based on outcomes, it's a very strong approach. So that's one way that you can engage the communities in planning. And then once you have your theory of change, for example, and then you make your indicators, which communities can devise their own indicators for what they want to be measuring, and then you go on to continually use those indicators as you would in any monitoring evaluation progress at specific times all the way through to the final evaluation. So it's really about building the knowledge and capacity of the communities that you work with so that when your project ends, they can in effect continue on with it themselves by the monitoring processes and the community work you've put together.
Thank you for that answer. In line with this question, a question from Alba Sarai Perez Teran. When you talk about community-based adaptation, you often talk about adaptation by farmers or in certain sectors. If you talk about community, do you then talk about specific groups within the community, or do you talk about all the stakeholders at local level?
Sure, that's a really good question. Thank you. When I think we're talking about community-based adaptation here, yes, you need to be looking for your particular project. What does community mean to you to begin with? Because obviously the definition of community or what each intervention takes to be a community is completely different that you've spoken about. Like, is it just groups of farmers or is it also other stakeholders? So I think community-based adaptation, yes, it can be those groups of farmers who are the ultimate stakeholder beneficiaries of your project. But within CBA, you need to be looking at all the other stakeholders involved in that area that are needed to be involved to help deliver adaptation benefits to your key group of stakeholders in the end.
How would you involve specifically local government and CBOs?
So again, it comes down to what the goal of your project is and actually what the long-term aim and the goal is to begin with, and then you can see which stakeholders are needed. So for this, again, you need to be doing an in-depth institutional analysis, and again doing it with the communities themselves to see who are the institutions they think are relevant that are needed to be on board. And then it's a question of approaching those stakeholders. I mean, a lot of projects I have worked on, some of the projects have been working in those areas for quite some time, so there's already a kind of relationship that has been built up there. But if it's in a new project area, you would need to go about finding what are the most culturally acceptable ways and which are the strongest ways you can engage to see if they are interested and how you can bring them in to the project. But this again, Dennis, brings up a key point about CBA projects. We need to be looking more long-term. Building these relationships with stakeholders is a long-term process. It's not necessarily going to happen in a year, 2 years.
Thank you. A question from Elinda Ekaputri. She says, I'm really new in the adaptation work. And I have to say, we're all very new in the adaptation work, so that's okay. What I don't understand is, if the climate impact is more or less uncertain at times, then how can we assess that the community has become less vulnerable?
Sure, that's an excellent question.
Less vulnerable against what?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And that's definitely one of those key questions that we all have to consider and take in, because that's one of the things about climate change adaptation. Climate change impacts are long term, and how do we know if we're building resilience for our communities until much longer term into the future? We don't know. But what we've shown, and what's hopefully being conveyed through our ARCAB approach, is that we need to be looking what can we be doing short term that will help affect change when those longer term changes happen. And again, this also reflects back to knowledge as well. I hear a lot of NGOs saying, well, what's the point, Lucy, of using, you know, a lot of scientific climate information which isn't local to our area? It's such a huge, you know, it's not being downscaled, so it's not useful for us. So what we need to be doing is working with local communities for their local knowledge, but we also need to be looking at building the capacity of these scientific climate research informations and the Met offices that we work with in order to seeing how we can make this information more available.
Yes, because in the end we're talking about decades in which you will see maybe a slight change. It's not that we expect a change in the next years with respect to climate, and also with respect to a bigger adaptation from our communities towards that long-term climate change. And that is something we often forget. A lot of people look at it and then start doing their work, and what you see is a lot of implementations towards short-term climate peaks instead of longer-term climate change. And a question from Daniela Tarizo. How does the tool address the difference between DRR and other climate-specific adaptation needs and actions in assuring resilience and guaranteeing success of CBA projects?
Okay, hi Daniela, thanks for your question. So what we can do through this is that, yes, obviously we've put DRR in here because many projects are DRR. It's also useful to help us see what's the difference between DRR and adaptation to climate change. But like you've said, it's not just DRR, it's all those other climate risks that will need to be evaluated. So that really comes into your evaluation of the adaptation context. So this tool can be adapted to suit any context and any risk that's happening, disaster risk, other climate risks, and other non-disaster and climate risks altogether. It's just having a full understanding of what is needed in that particular area, and then catering, using the system to cater to plan. So this M&E system really starts with planning. So what can be done to plan for those risks, and therefore what necessarily M&E indicators would be relevant for that.
Which gets me to a question from Alba Sarai Perez-Teran. He says our project is looking at synergies between adaptation and mitigation, and right now we are talking only about CBA, and we don't call it CBA-ME or CBM. So any suggestions on how to design simple mitigation indicators to be part of a project where synergies are between adaptation and mitigation?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. Thank you. Yeah, I think there's been quite a lot of debate within the CBA circles about community-based mitigation as well, and I know that IIED actually led on some work on this called ADAPT, I think it was in the end. It was quite a few years ago. So I haven't, with where I've tested this framework and this approach so far, I haven't actually come across many. I haven't had to devise many indicators for community-based mitigation, is what I'm trying to say, but I don't see there's no reason why they can't be included in this, because that would come under certain knowledge that you need for that and come under capacity. So I definitely think they can be integrated into these frameworks, as again, these frameworks are tailored specific to a project. So if a project is looking at the linkages between adaptation and mitigation, and therefore looking at what is the knowledge and the capacity and the practice needed for mitigation, then specific indicators can be devised for that.
Kim Sun has a specific question about one indicator, and that is the one that we see here at a sub-indicator for the first outcome area, level of knowledge. He asks, how do you measure local communities' knowledge of climate change, and in what sense would you measure whether they have new knowledge, and is that new knowledge appropriate towards their adaptation?
Sure, that's a great question. How you measure these indicators is really down to the field tools that you use. So once we've devised these indicators, part of my job and for other M&E practitioners is obviously then to go away and work out what are the best tools to get this information. I have done a lot of assessing levels of knowledge through various ways, through focus group discussions, for example, by asking a series of questions that really try and search and find the information that I'm looking for from that, to understand their level of understanding. It's also done through various PRA tools, participatory rapid appraisal tools, to help them with their explanation. So from what we've done so far, these levels of knowledge are done primarily through asking different types of questions and maybe getting them to show you how they're doing things differently now to what they maybe done before and why. Because I think this is a key point about CBA and what we need to be looking at. What people may do now in terms of practice may not be that different maybe to what they may do in the future against climate change. But it's the knowledge that is different behind why they're doing it is what we need to look at. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point you make there. A question from Andre Napitopoulou, and that's an interesting one as well. Is there any difference, a real difference in M&E approach between looking at adaptation and looking at resilience? Especially when using community participatory approaches. And when you look at the development of approaches over time, it seems like the word adaptation just has slowly been changed into resilience, but the underlying community participatory M&E approaches haven't changed all that much.
Sure. And again, these questions about terminology, and this again, I think this is also very much part of the debate. What is difference about resilience? What is the difference about adaptation? I don't think there's any set answer to what the difference is. Like I said, resilience and transformation have become, some buzzwords within the field at the moment, but resilience can be another way of looking at working towards adaptation. And the ARCAB approach is one way we're looking at resilience, but I know many other organisations have their own different interpretations of resilience as well.
Yeah, I like the approaches that I see coming out of the livelihoods idea of resilience a lot. I know that Bruce Raversloot, who you met in Kathmandu at the South Asia Evaluation Conclave, has some really clear ideas about the differences between resilience and adaptation. And perhaps I should have him do a webinar purely on where adaptation and resilience come from and what he sees as the differences between the two, because there is quite a lot to say about it, and there are quite some different views on the topic. Which gets me to another question by Maxwell Madzikanga, I hope I say that correctly. How is CBA connected with other M&E frameworks, other bigger impact areas? And he gives HIV/AIDS as example, because HIV/AIDS is also framed in an M&E framework in national monitoring systems. And how would CBA and adaptation, if you are able to look upstream, how would that link to other bigger picture type of MDG-sized impacts?
Sure. So what I would say about CBA is that CBA isn't necessarily a sector in itself. It's something that works across sectors.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking at HIV or looking at education, you can still be looking at that through a CBA lens. So you can be looking at what indicators you may be using for HIV, but making them in light of climate risk. So like I said, in the ARCAB framework, it's looking at those adaptive capacity indicators. So many different sectors will fit into there, but you just need to be ensuring that they're being measured in light of climate risk, which kind of brings that CBA element to it. There are many other different, as you say, M&E frameworks available at higher national levels. This is one that is being, brought in the that is started at community level for this reason. For example, the IIED TAND approach that I mentioned, that looks more at adaptation at national level. But what we can be doing through CBA is targeting what we're doing on the ground to be able to make sure it informs those bigger long-term goals. So we need to be sure as M&E practitioners that we're clear about what the long-term goal is that we're trying to achieve through the project, and then link the M&E system through indicators and through what we're doing to that accordingly.
Talking about the 4 levels that we are having here, in these 4 levels, what's the pathway of learning strategy? How does learning work, and how is it integrated as well on the higher levels into government agencies?
Sure.
Maybe that also goes more towards the TAMD framework that you just were referring to.
Sure. As from the experience we've had of using this, I said it's quite a new approach, hasn't been around that long. So from the experience of it that I've had so far, like when I used it in Somaliland, when we were building a theory of change for the new Save the Children in Somaliland longer-term CBA strategy, we sat with the government at national level to help inform it. And we sat with the communities all together to help inform a longer-term view. So it is informing what's happening at their levels, and they're able to communicate to us what they need in order to better support communities on the ground. So this approach is really a collaborative one. It's really bringing stakeholders together to affect change together. So it's really working in different ways to what a lot of CBA practice has been done up until now.
And if you look at that national level, they are already measuring quite often on vulnerability. The question is,
yes.
What type of additional dimension does climate change add to measuring vulnerability on a national level? And any experience in that sense?
Not as yet using this M&E framework, but when we're looking at climate change, we just have to understand that, it's, even though we may not have the specific impact of exactly what's going to happen, but generally understanding is that it's going to intensify the current context. So if we're looking at measures of vulnerability at national level, we just need to reassess them and go over them to ensure that it takes longer term climate change risk into account. So maybe looking at adjusting the indicator if it takes that in longer term perspective into account or not. And then also maybe looking at adding indicators into those national ones about what is needed to make that happen in terms of maybe climate information that is needed or other different capacities. And
in your experience discussing this in already a number of countries, how did you have any problems with creating buy-in on the level of national or subnational policymakers? Are there any obstacles that you ran into, or do you have any tips for creating buy-in on the policy-making level?
Sure, I have to say I've been quite fortunate in that experience that people that I've worked with, they know that they had to be changing what they're doing, but they really didn't understand how to. So I think also what the ARCAB has been able to approach to is to advise them how we can make it differently. So in terms of buy-in, I mean, yes, obviously more people are always going to be understanding why they need it or not, but I haven't as yet come across people that we've needed to work with that have just not been interested in working in it. So in that case, I've been fortunate, and so like I said, it's been an interesting process to help people understand what they need to be doing differently. I think everyone's understanding that we do need to be doing differently, but how and what do we need to do? So this process, I think, really helps answer those questions as well, once you translate it to specific contexts. And
in your experience, did you just get buy-in in the sense that people were willing to discuss the idea, or did you get buy-in in the sense that people really wanted to help and actively think about strategies?
Both. I think especially the latter one, though, actually wanting to realise that ways they had been working to date, you know, was almost just kind of like crossing the T's and dotting the I's, as it were, and wasn't really making that much of a difference and change. And so I think using something like the theory of change approach has really helped people understand that they can think about how they should strategically be thinking and how they can be doing it differently through a practical, straightforward approach. So I know, for example, that when we work with the theory of change from communities up to national level within Bangladesh, for example, I mean, the feedback we just got was phenomenal from this approach, and enabling them to think what changes need to happen and how they can go about it in a very logical way. And it was very supportive from what they said.
On the community level, would you have examples? That's a question from Samreen Babar. Would you have any examples of different adaptation strategies that you see being developed by farmers?
I have just, for example, I had just come back from working with UNDP on their CBA project in Namibia specifically, and they have had some phenomenal results with farmers that have been working in a very much a drought and flood context. And what they have been doing, they've been starting to use a farming technique called conservation agriculture, known as CA, and it's a new way of reaping and farrowing your fields. There's some scientific background behind it as well, that has actually enabled the farmers to grow their main crop, which is pearl millet, and to grow it in phenomenal amounts and quality, even within a drought zone, as was nationally declared when I was there. And so this adaptation strategy has helped them change the way they think about planning and managing their fields and planting early, and changing the practices that they're doing with that, and therefore changing the machinery they also need. And again, this wasn't specifically designed necessarily, well, I mean, it was designed with climate change in mind, but this is also just a great, fantastic approach for farmers in general, and it's just showing even more now that it's working in drought context, that obviously it holds a lot of value for longer term climate change risks. But I mean, this was a phenomenal example. I mean, I think before using this approach, farmers may have got 300 kg of pearl millet per hectare, and from post using this approach in a drought context, one farmer in particular got 4,850 kg per hectare. I mean, it's just the difference is phenomenal.
Yeah, it's an approach. I will look up conservation agriculture. I didn't hear about that one yet. One of the things I stumbled upon was that you see more and more combination of agriculture and payment for ecosystem services, and that is an interesting development as well. And we're getting to the last question from Dago Tsering, and he asks, given that M&E is a continuous effort, what happens if the initial actors change? Because you say the community can continue the process after the project ends, but how do you create institutional memory?
Yeah, again, an excellent question, and this is something that I think organisations come up against all the time, isn't it? Even within communities and even as M&E practitioners, we can learn so much and then we ourselves often move on to different contexts. So one of the main things about ARCAB we're going to have to work very much on is knowledge management and this institutional memory. So I guess when we're looking at it in a community context, yes, community members come and go, and especially with different forces, people may be migrating more or less or not. So it's really trying to teach people that can then, this is how scaling out can also happen quite quickly, is to teach people in a way that they're then capacitated fully themselves to teach others and getting those others to teach other people. And I guess it's also part of the M&E people in a project to ensure that this is happening and to keep an eye on if key stakeholders that have been trained are not around so much anymore, and therefore looking at how to maybe train other people up. So I mean, this is definitely a way, rather than the INGO holding, you know, a lot of training sessions for different people, but train specific amount of people up very well and get them to then teach others. And like I was saying, it's with scaling out. If communities see value and they see the difference changes practices are making, they will naturally teach each other and it will continue anyway. And I think holding on to that kind of essence to ensure that practice can continue going within community settings.
And I have to say, because of that answer, I actually got two more questions that I'll take together in one question, and that's then really the last one. Given that we are looking at long-term impacts, and given that we are looking at long-term approaches both in the project and its implementation and in the M&E of the immediate output and the longer-term outcomes and impact, we are often talking about the current vulnerability people have towards future climate change, in a sense. How do you measure future vulnerability, and linked to that, how do you put the longer term aspect and something like current versus future vulnerability into a baseline?
Sure. So again, this does come down to a certain amount of climate change knowledge. But again, obviously we have this problem of downscaling climate change and scientific information. So it's about capacity building scientific institutions along with this local knowledge to try and get more information that's useful. But what we can do through our projects is measure changes in vulnerability as the projects continue. Obviously it will be hard to put a monitoring evaluation indicator out there for what future vulnerability might be, because we're not so sure right now. So all we can be doing is measuring what's happening now in light of taking these longer term risks into consideration now. And so what the longer term aspect allows us to do, like I said, is to rethink the way we're doing development and to take those longer term impacts into consideration now. So what can we be doing now to build people's knowledge that they will need and capacity to help deal with these longer term impacts in the future, even though it's obviously we don't understand exactly what those impacts will be, but at least it's almost a process of helping communities understand that yes, we might not be what is coming, but you know it's going to be different, and therefore we need to be changing the way we're thinking and what we're doing. It's also instilling that capacity that they can adapt as changes happen over the forthcoming years. So getting them to think what they can be doing to change.
Lucy,
was that all the questions?
That was all the questions, and I want to thank you very much for both your webinar. It was very interesting to learn more about the ARCAB M&E approach, and I have the feeling we will be hearing more about both the ARCAB M&E approach and about you. And thank you as well for answering all these questions. I know it's not easy because they are shooting them at you and you have a few seconds to think about them and you have to come up with a clever answer very quickly. So thank you very much.
No, my pleasure. But I'd just like to say, Dennis, thank you also very much for your support with this. But if I didn't answer anyone's question sufficiently, please email it to me and then I can think about it and respond.
And given that this is a two-tier webinar, we will send out an email once both recordings have been put online together with all the reading materials that have been discussed. And you were right, Lucy, this one, the ARCAB M&E Baseline Strategy Final Report, is already online, and we'll present the links to you. And we will send out an email about that somewhere in the first half next week. And in that email you will also get the email addresses of both Tina and Lucy. So if you have any questions at that point, you can still bring them up at that point directly with Lucy and Tina, if that's okay with you, Lucy.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. It'd be my pleasure.
Thanks again, Lucy, and that leaves me at wishing everyone a very pleasant continuation of your day and a very good weekend. Thank you for taking part in this webinar.